Okay, this is the first time I'm trying a screencast. We're going to do a little review of where we're at so far in the American Revolution, the Siege of Boston, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and what you're seeing in front of you now, of course, is just a a little more than the eastern part of the United States. Kind of got the blue dot here showing you, of course, where South Carolina is, and then where Boston, Massachusetts is in the northeast. All right, a little closer view. You can see Boston is very close to New York. See where I'm trying to make a circle here with my finger. And the battle will eventually move once the British leave Boston. It will move to New York, but we'll save that for later on. Okay, first off, one of the first things we talked about when we started the Revolution was the Battle at Concord and Lexington, or the shot heard around the world, when the British soldiers were sent to find ammunition, weapons, powder, and as the crowd or the Minutemen tried to disperse, then shots were fired. Who shot first and how many actually died, of course, is always up for debate. You hear 7 from some experts, 8 from others. All we know is that it did send shockwaves throughout the colonies, and as the British were marching back to Boston, that's where they were ambushed. The Minutemen drove them in and kind of barricaded them off, and we'll see how that happened when we see the geographical layout of Boston. Okay, that's just another view of Boston and New York. All right, you can see this is what we would call the main downtown area of Boston, Massachusetts, and you can see it's connected, kind of a little bottleneck there. And so as they came back in, the Americans kind of blocked them off right there, where the only place they could get away was by getting on a boat in the harbor. And this area over here is Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill. We'll talk about momentarily. If you see the blue kind of areas, little square areas here, you can see that's where the colonists or the Continental Army were stationed. Most of the British were contained right here. Also, eventually onto the Charlestown Peninsula here, where Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill are located. Okay, this is, of course, a Google Earth image. You'll notice that I've already circled a few things right here, and kind of in the upper left, you can see that this is, actually I'm off just a little bit. You have Bunker Hill and Breeds Hill. Bunker Hill in this area, Breeds Hill in that area, Bunker Hill right about here. What happened in the Battle of Bunker Hill was that the British ships were anchored, in this area right here. They fired their cannons, and through the smoke they attacked almost in a straight-on attack at the Americans. And I'll get to how that ended up here momentarily. On to the next slide. Another overview. Again, we have we've kind of had them partitioned off right here, and also Dorchester Heights, which we did not show on the previous map, is located down here. And the cannons that we saw in the movie John Adams that Henry Knox, who I will show you briefly, when he brought those back from Fort Ticonderoga, he set those up around Dorchester Heights, right in this area right here. Another part that we need to discuss is Cambridge, which is where modern-day Harvard University is located. That's also where George Washington made his base out of. That's where his office was during the Siege of Boston. We'll move on to the next slide. Couldn't get this to get as big as I wanted to. You can see the fortifications. The top area, this is Charlestown, Bunker Hill, and Breeds Hill. This is red is the British, of course, redcoats. And then right here, redcoats. And the blue would be the colonists. Again, my slides are kind of crossed up, but Dorchester Heights is where they put the cannons with Henry Knox. But right now we're talking about Bunker Hill. Right slide for you here. All right, this is, I tried to turn it to get a good angle of Bunker Hill, and it is a hill. It's not a mountain. I've actually been there. Kind of almost unimpressive when you get there and walk up to it, but very historical. So if you have the opportunity to go to Boston, it's a very historic town. If you're a fan of history, then it's somewhere that you definitely need to go. But it's in a residential area. Of course, it's kind of hard to imagine with all the apartments and townhouses and homes around it. It's kind of hard to get in the right frame of mind of being a soldier during that time period, but still nonetheless very, very historic. Here you get an idea of how the soldiers would have been dressed at that time period. This is the 5th Regiment, of course, British redcoats. Got the bayonets fixed on their muskets. And this is kind of an original drawing, but they kind of took some liberties with it. The hill was not that big, but you can see the attack that they made. General Howe for the British attacked General Artemus Ward and General Putnam for the Continental Army. Basically 2,400 British troops against about 1,500 Americans. Now the British had light guns and were supported by the heavy guns from the Navy fleet, while the Americans were armed with just muskets or whatever firearms they could obtain. So they were outnumbered, and they also did not have equal amounts of weapons. Now, when the outbreak of the war started, General Gage, the commander-in-chief, found himself blockaded in Boston by the Continental Army. So that's when he decided they needed to make a move. On June 16, 1775, the 1,500 troops of Massachusetts and Putnam's Connecticut Regiment, they occupied Breed's Hill and Bunker's Hill, and the presence of the American on the peninsula was observed by the ships in the harbor, and they opened fire on them. The end result is the British did take the hill, but they suffered 1,100 casualties, and nearly the other half was either injured or retreated. The American casualties were estimated about 450. So the British took the hill, but they suffered more deaths and casualties than the Americans did. So you would almost call that a victory for the Americans. And the British also learned that the colonists or the Americans or the Continental Army, whatever you wanted to call them at that point, they still didn't really have a name army. It was basically regiments from the different colonies. They had proven they were not going to be put down easily, not as easily as King George III thought that they might. All right, here's a better map of Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, and you can see from the red they attacked from the sea, from a southern vantage point, straight up the hill. Now, if we listen, going back to Sun Tzu and his military strategies, we'll see that that was not a smart move. That's why they suffered so many casualties, because the higher ground was occupied by the colonists or by the Continental Army, and they went straight at them. So it's no wonder that they were put down like that. All right, this gentleman right here is Henry Knox. He is the gentleman that I've discussed with you in class that made the trek to Fort Ticonderoga. Remember, Fort Ticonderoga was used during the French and Indian War. It had been abandoned, and the cannons there were still just sitting at the fort. So the idea was to take those and bring them back. They were large cannons, and something that we did not have in Boston. Okay, that's a picture of the fort right there. It's a tourist attraction today. Of course, this is the aerial view of Fort Ticonderoga. I can't emphasize enough the terrain that they had to be cannons, probably a couple of tons apiece. On the slide I want to show you, here we go. Across this much territory in the middle of December. This is a very, of course, heavily wooded, heavily mountainous area, a couple of rivers to cross. They fell through the ice with them and had to get them out. They couldn't winch them out. They didn't have bulldozers. They didn't have trucks. They didn't have four-wheelers. And the fact that it took them, they thought 2 weeks, but due to the weather and the terrain and the things that went wrong along the way, it took them 6 weeks. But when they did finally arrive, I'm going to